Good morning, all. The topic of today's video lecture is death as a mystic experience in the poems of Emily Dickinson. Emily and her poems are prescribed in the university syllabus of Kerala under American literature for both UG and PG. I am hoping that this video will help you to gain an understanding on the poet as well as her poems. Death is not a pleasant word or an idea to be discussed. When you hear about the word death, it will create some uneasiness, and definitely it will take you to a world of dejection. But at the same time, death is one of the unavoidable necessities of human life. We cannot avoid death or the concept of death. As Andrew Marvell, in one of his poems to his coy mistress, he wrote, "At my back I always hear time's winged chariot is hurrying near." Time or death is always following us, or rather it walks together with us. People have different concept on death. For some, death is a destroyer. It destroys your happiness, your desires, your wishes that you to be with your family or with your dear near ones. So therefore, for some, it is a destroyer. And for some others, death is a comforter, or rather it's a rescuer. It rescues people from the world of reality, the world of pain, agony, stress, like many. So people take death as one of the solacer of their life, which gives them at most happiness. But in a spiritual way, death is the culmination of life. The culmination means which is the highest point of happiness. In religiously or in spiritually, we could state it as nirvana. The moment you achieve the greatest pleasure in life. For the romantics of the English literature, for them nature was an escape route. They always find nature as a means to escape from the mundane, dull, materialistic life in which they lived. So therefore, for them nature was an escape route. But for some others, it was death, like Emily and Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath, like Emily, is one of the famous figure, a poet in American literature. She wrote, "Dying is an art, like any other." So for her, death was unknown to her, for Sylvia. But Emily is something else. So, let me ask you a question. Can you love death? Or can you embrace death? It will be very difficult for people like us to say a yes to the question. But Emily Dickinson has, or rather, she is a very different person from us. For her, death was something else. Can you imagine a person who could write more than 500 poems on a single theme, death? How can a person write such numerous poems on a single theme? So there will be some aspects, there will be some hidden reasons behind that. So in order to understand death as a mystic experience in the poems of Emily Dickinson, or the concept of death in the poems of Emily Dickinson, we have to know what was her concept on death. So we can find out a few reasons or the few concepts of Emily regarding death. For Emily, death was a cosmic truth. She accepted it, one of the facts of human life. So life starts from a birth and it has to be end with death. So she accepted and she realized that it is one of the fact. And therefore, she never frightened over death. She never had any fear on death. So that's the first concept, that she accepted it as a cosmic truth, whereas people like us, or some of us, can't accept it as a cosmic truth. The second is, death was a door to immortality for her. She believed that death is not an end, but rather it is another life. It is an opening for another world, that is immortality, eternal life, where you can enjoy, where you can start another life. The third concept of Emily regarding death is that she took death as a comforter. So we all live in a stress world of reality. The life which we are leading is problem filled. Chaos, agonies, pains, sufferings, or rather it is all about confusions, which can't guarantee you any form of happiness. So likewise Emily took it as a form of comfort. It is a source of comfort where you could enjoy the utmost happiness. And the last concept of Emily regarding death is, Emily was obsessed with death. How can a person be obsessed with death? The one thing, that person has to be a victim of death, or there will be some other reasons behind that to get obsessed with something. But Emily was obsessed with death. What will be the reasons? So there are a few reasons. So in order to know the mystic experience of death in her poems, in Emily's poems, it is very vital and it is very important to know the life of Emily Dickinson. What was he? So in Emily's life, there was a series of death incidents has had happened, starting with her cousin and with Otis, who was a guy who supposed to be her lover. And in between them, she had lost her father, her mother, her teacher. So there was a series of death occurred in the life of Emily. So therefore, Emily was influenced, or rather she was affected by their loss. So she was more attracted, rather she was obsessed with death, the concept of death. And when we look into the life of Emily, Emily was a person who was self-restricted, rather self-restrained person. She never engaged in any social gatherings. So she lives in America, and think about, social gathering is one of the normal thing that is in the American life. But Emily stood away from that. Emily never bothered about any social gatherings. Rather, she lived in her house. Emily was not married, even though Emily had some male friends. So Emily lived in the confinements of life. So she was all alone, and therefore we could say that she enjoyed the loneliness that she had. And Emily was a Puritan, a strong Puritan. So Emily was closely affected, or rather she was closely influenced or tied her life with the concept of religion. She was very familiar with Bible. As you could see, you are well know about the concept of Puritanism. They were very familiar with Bible, and they followed the Bible as such. And religion was one of the important responsible reason for Emily to think and to write on the theme of death. So it was one of the reasons for Emily to write poems or to be obsessed more into death as a concept. So now we shall go and analyze 3 poems of Emily, which I felt are some of the significant poems of Emily. So I am not giving you the poem as such, but rather I will be explaining what the poems talks about. The first poem of our consideration is Death is a Dialogue Between, which is numbered as 976 poem of Emily. The poem talks about the spiritual aspect of death. The poem, as it is titled as Death is a Dialogue Between. So it is in a conversation mode. The conversation between dust and spirit. Dust, which stands for the human flesh, and the spirit as well. Death and spirit, or rather dust and spirit, are the 2 elements of human existence. So it is a dialogue between them. Death is considered as an arrival which separates the human body and the flesh. Human body goes to the grave and it gets decayed, but spirit is dissolved. Even though it cannot be seen or touched, it moves to the eternal world, a world of immortality, where it has originated in a spiritual way. So Emily's poem, Death is a Dialogue Between. Death is treated as an arrival, and which arrives and which separates the human body and the flesh. So she talks about the spiritual nature of the death in the poem Death is a Dialogue Between. And the second poem of our consideration is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Is an evergreen poem of Emily Dickinson. It is one of the most poems which is prescribed in the syllabus. is an unavoidable poem of Emily. So, because I could not stop for death, Emily portrays death as a suitor. Can you think or can you imagine death as a suitor? Death as a gentleman who is to marry you? It's quite impossible. But for Emily, death was a suitor. Death was a gentleman to whom she gets married. So, in the poem, death is treated as a gentleman, and the gentleman, the death, and the poet, and immortality. All the three goes back to the heavenly abode, to heaven, in a horse-driven carriage. So Emily, in this poem, because I could not stop for death, she talks about the fearlessness of death. That humans are not supposed to fear about death. That's the message that she conveys. So we all have a tendency to fear death. But for her, she talks to us that through the poem that there is no reason to fear about death. So that's the second poem, because I could not stop for death. The third poem of our consideration is I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. It's numbered as 280, the poem 280. I felt a funeral in my brain. The poet dramatizes the whole episode of a funeral in her brain, the funeral of the poet. So again, she expresses the fearlessness of death. She imagines, or rather she dramatizes, what is going to happen or what happens during a funeral. So she hears the mourners has come. They start weeping, and she listens to the drum beating sound, and she hears the bell which announces death. A mourners takes a coffin to the grave and where it buried, but the soul dissolved. Or rather, it moves forward to a world of eternity. So the poem symbolizes the concept of death as a cosmic truth. It is an unavoidable fact, and it is something that has to be happened at some point of our human life. So the poet, in all these three poems which we have considered, that she was giving us a message that it has a spiritual nature. It has that it is something that not to be afraid of, and it is something that you could love. For Emily, death is a very pleasant occurrence. She treated it as a journey. She held death as something very close to her. She loved death. So in one of her other poems, which is titled as There is Something Quieter Than Sleep. So we humans, if someone asks you, which is the most comfortable state of your life, then definitely you will be giving sleep as a reply. But for Emily, there is something is quieter than sleep. So there is something something that could give beyond a quiet situation, a quiet atmosphere in your life. And for Emily, it was death. I quote Emily, goodbye to the life I used to live and the world I used to know, and kiss the hills for me just once. Now I am ready to go. For Emily, death relieves a person from anxieties, from the stress, the mundane, dull, material life of conflicts. Therefore, as a conclusion, we could say, in Emily's words, the deathlessness of death. Emily enjoyed, rather she exercised the deathlessness of death, that death never has an end. It lives. It takes us to the other world of immortality, eternity. So therefore, death as a mystic experience in the poems of Emily Dickinson, she talks us about the deathlessness of life, or rather the deathlessness of death. Thank you.